Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be here, all the way on the other side of the world from South Africa. A big thank you to my hosts, Ulster University and BDON, for inviting me, to Sherry Driver, Brian Patterson and Siobhan Mullen in particular, and the audience tonight for this very generous opportunity to share some thoughts. It's my first visit to the city, and I'm not going to offer any trite observations from a very short introduction to a highly complex context, but I can't resist just one parallel, if you'll just indulge me. On the superficial side, we have a Belfast in South Africa too. This is what it looks like. It's a very small town in a province called Mpumalanga. I actually discovered in my tour of the city the other day that we actually also have a piece of Belfast in South Africa. Apparently, quite a fine replica of your city hall exists in Durban. I didn't know that. On a more serious note, both of our societies sought peace agreements within 4 years of one another, and are evidently still working out how to weight the past in the present. How arts and culture relate to this recalibration of the public sphere is a key question, and my talk tonight cuts into this. It's about performing the present. I'm going to make 3 moves through time and space. First, to set some conceptual ground, we'll head to the streets of Johannesburg, and I'll give you an overview of a curated trilogy of artistic interventions called New Imaginaries, which explored notions of public space. I'll just highlight some key aspects of that research I conducted into the trilogy within a broad framework of the commons. Next, we'll head underground, quite literally, with a brief diversion to Cape Town and a collaborative sound art intervention between myself and another artist called Cape Town Under, the Third Voice, which differently animates some of these ideas from a network of tunnels. Finally, we will emerge to track the second life of a recently banished artwork in the same city, a colonial era sculpture on a university campus, which is a public heritage site, to reflect upon its performative afterlife that culminates in a recent occupation led by fine art students late last year. This conflagration connects us back to where we started, considering how art can help make sense of the contemporary moment, what's going on in the world at large, and reimagine city futures. I myself work across disciplines as a researcher, writer, and art practitioner, so this multimodality informs my outlook. In short, I think about artwork as a vector of inquiry into the world. In this larger sense of mobility, all art is potentially live art, on the move, taking us to unexpected places, venturing into the unknown, and working with uncertainties. Its beginnings and endings are more elastic than we often suppose. Performance art, for instance, may start when a work is given over to the receiving public to carry. In that same sense, it never really ends. Art is a series of second lives that are unforeseeable and quite wayward. An intervention releases multiple trajectories beyond measure. This is perhaps part of art's incommensurability. Once released into the world, it's live, it goes on a journey full of multiplicities, twists and turns. Likewise, dead art may be undead, as we will see, zombie art perhaps. What we think of as ephemeral may have an enduring knock-on effect, and what we regard as concrete may be knocked off its plinth. It's perhaps more meaningful to think of art in motion as a vector, a conduit that conducts the making of meaning and insight, potentially new knowledge. Art can also conduct wishful thinking. It's a way to speculate about the future, and this notion of aspiration is where we will end. The past is mentioned as a way of reinserting itself into the present. Back in South Africa, we're grappling with this in a very charged way right now, how to deal with what some activists are calling the afterwards. What they mean by that is a whole new generation of South Africans have come of age. 48% of our population is under 24 years, who thankfully have no experience of lived apartheid, which ended officially in 1994. They were born in a democratic era. We call them the born frees, and yet are hugely frustrated. They're frustrated because they are not seeing a political miracle translated into a socio-economic one at fast enough pace. What they're seeing is different kinds of inequality and how that permeates society in many ways, so many ways that it kind of reinscribes the politics of the past. They're not prepared to accept the reconciliatory moves of yesteryear and are drawing a line and saying enough, pushing eject, and this is often in conflict with currently vested power. The mode of this dissent is performative, perhaps best understood as interruptions of various kinds, and vectors of this unfinished business have increasingly included artworks. One artwork in particular caught the public imagination these past 2 years, ignited by an act of performative rage that first lit a student body and then a tinderbox of issues that basically launched a national movement for systemic change to redress continued inequities. I'm going to come back to the sculpture at the end of my talk, but in brief, it was eventually taken off its campus plinth, as I mentioned, the public heritage site, and remains at a secret location while its future fate is debated. Meanwhile, however, its spectral presence is helping to reimagine the public sphere. The artwork is lit, to use popular slang. Continued student protests bring me here on a tide of disruption from our universities and beyond. If you've caught any of the news from South Africa this past week, you'll see that we're at a political and economic crossroads at the moment. This is our afterwards, and we are still busy working it out. What is certain in these unclear times is that art has a role to play. I will start by stepping back to offer just a little bit of context for expressions in South African public space, and then head into some artwork examples. South Africa post-apartheid has made great strides since 1994. Along with some of the finest rights and a fantastic constitution, 3.7 million housing opportunities have been created. That's a mix of houses and stands. 86% of households are electrified, that was up from 50%. 73.3% of the population now has access to water, 79.5% to flush sanitation, 64% to refuse removal. Life expectancy has risen to 62.5 years, and the infant mortality rate has decreased. Perhaps most importantly, 17 million people are now supported in a vital social security net of grants. That's up from 4 million. But South Africa is a place of paradox. It's also well understood that the country remains a markedly unequal one in various respects. One of the highest Gini coefficients in the world reflects this disparity in income terms. To put the situation more bluntly in broad wealth terms, 20 years after democracy, the 2 richest people in South Africa had the same wealth as the bottom half of the population. That's according to Oxfam's report, Even It Up. It's perhaps less appreciated how these inequities are spatially replicated in the present tense. This relates to a series of spatial segregation laws through land dispossession. The Native Lands Act of 1913 was a cornerstone of that racial jigsaw, but the story spans back to Dutch colonial settlements from the 1600s onwards. Moreover, the spatial inequalities reinscribed in contemporary South Africa through continued urban sprawl that generally keeps a privileged minority in economic centralities and a minority to urban peripheries. You only need to visit Cape Town, landing at the airport, and drive towards the CBD to see for yourself how the geography of the city is still very segregated into pockets. That image is a picture of Hout Bay, which is one of our suburbs. You can see a kind of leafy privileged section on the one side, and then another settlement to the right, and some shacks starting towards the upper edge of the image. About 2 weeks ago, some fires broke out in that shack settlement, and 2/3 of it was wiped out and 15,000 people displaced. So Zaki Ahmad, who heads up a social justice movement called Ndufuna Ikwazi, gave evidence at a commission of inquiry into policing in Khayelitsha, which is a township, that looked into daily realities, where he outlined this effect of spatial segregation. He said, "We need to take seriously that we're forcing Black African people further and further out of the city instead of creating an integrated city, and that has an impact on policing, on education, and on service delivery," unquote. Added to this, the world is fast urbanizing, which intensifies these dynamics. By 2050, 2/3 of the world's population is expected to live in cities. If you think about it, in 1800, only 3% of the global population lived in urban areas, and the African continent is at the sharp end of this dynamic, with sub-Saharan Africa more than doubling its population between now and 2050, and its urban areas growing by almost 800 million people. That's according to the Braintrust Foundation. Its cities in turn become nodes that surface related issues, an agglomeration of so-called wicked problems. Some of these imbricated issues fall beyond what is easily measurable. For instance, the register of informality in which global South cities often operate. This is where an artistic register can be particularly helpful. Both the arts and geography are expanding fields with common ground, according to Harriet Hawkins. One of these intersecting fields is public space. Action Ming points out that the achievements of public space presuppose other dynamics of inclusion, notably provision of the means to ensure that humans can participate as fully fledged social subjects in urban life. Amin says in The Good City that many urban dwellers have yet to acquire this right. This is particularly evident in the global South, he says, where urban planning practices are driven by the needs of the economically and politically most powerful. Without a guarantee of rightful citizenship, he says, interventions in public space will amount to no more than tinkering on the edges. This is something to keep in mind as we move among our projects. Many of the interventions themselves critique these very same issues and bring associated invisibilities to the fore. Amin's words also trigger for me a cautionary note about the ethics of participatory techniques, which artists need to give special attention to when working in spaces of power imbalance, where people have complex histories of being written over. In the New Imaginaries projects to follow, the curators pursued an immersive technique where they spent a lot of time studying spaces, taking creative cues from the environment itself, along with a lot of engagement with locals, instead of sort of imposing a preconceived idea. In this sense, the space was itself a creative agent. New Imaginaries. The African Centre for Cities at the University of Cape Town, which had a public culture lab at the time, set up a collaboration to academically shadow a project trilogy called New Imaginaries, which was conceived by Goethe Institute, a cultural organization. Its aim was to explore notions of public space in Johannesburg through independently curated artistic intervention. I was appointed by ACC as a researcher to reflect upon this trilogy and articulated the outcome in a book which you've heard about, The Art of Public Space. The book's narrative form takes a musical cue inspired by Rosie Bardotti's transpositions, a term for shifting a composition from one key into another. New Imaginaries happened in different parts of Johannesburg, primarily the inner city. It may be helpful to just understand that Johannesburg inner city suffered capital flight during the 1980s and 90s, as commercial interests, bar some exceptions, generally left the CBD for securitized northern suburbs. This in turn made room for the takeover of vacated buildings by low-income residents looking for somewhere closer to job opportunities and entrepreneurs who have made the inner city their home. New Imaginaries took to heart a provocation by Ashil Mbembe about a perceived crisis of imagination. Later, in a public lecture, he elaborated on this. He said, "There is a close relationship between the imagination and meaningful future expression. Today, the future has almost disappeared as a philosophical concern. The future has become a scarce resource for all sorts of reasons. It's very difficult to enchant the present. Ways to re-enchant must not only come from the economy, but also from arts and culture. But for this to happen, we must have an idea of how to theorize the present." Close quote. The first project, called Shoe Shop, was a month-long exploration about movement, walking, and migration, a kind of ambulatory thinking about being on the move. It was told through personal narratives and engaged with different forms of getting about: the processional parade, a street bash, guided city walks, gatherings, and public transit routes. It was co-curated by Marie-Hélène Goupillet and Cara Sneeman. Shoe Shop included photography on boundary spaces, such as taxi ranks and overlooked walls, performances, film projections, and related workshops, plus an anthology. Shoe Shop's concerns are best evident in a series of Saturday city walks led by artists who map the urban fabric in novel ways. Dung Anwar Jahangir of the Dala Collective described in his walk an arc through the city space, conceived of as an architecture without walls, as he put it, a transient architecture that travels with people as they move. He highlighted overlooked aspects of public space and proposed a humanizing politics of the in-between. This began at the symbolic site of the famous Constitutional Court and meandered through the densely populated inner-city neighborhood of Hillbrow, ending at a park and lunch adjacent to nearby taxi rank. Jahangir spoke about the city in terms of interstices: road, pavement, boundary wall, alley. In this particular alley, we found the number for God, apparently. He demonstrated how in these tangible gaps, like the road meeting the pavement, control becomes lost and cracks in the asphalt appear, where realizations start to happen. Or at in-between sites, like a traffic island, where people have reclaimed the grass as public space to sit and chat, they find their own way of humanizing themselves on the street. Here you see the start of an artist walk led by Rongato Shlasani, also known as MC Martzeleng, a walk around Hillbrow as well, showing how the roots of the Kwaito music genre are based in this inner city borough. He walks us from place to place and brings various sites alive through the stories and musical tracks that he weaves, playing them on a retro boombox and subverting stereotypes as we go. Another sonic tour of Saturday morning stores with names like Style Diva and Mr. Fashion that entice shoppers with musical performances from karaoke to bell ringing was led by artist Donna Kukama. It was also a kind of audio installation but using found sounds, an immersive experience of noting how music was a way of claiming territory in the city. This walk also brought out other ways territory is marked and enforced when Kukama and Anne Historical, also known as Bettina Molkemes, enacted a shoeshine performance, which is depicted here, at random intervals along the way. This led to bemused interest from passers-by, who formed a quick crowd around the two, but it also triggered altercations with both traders and security personnel who appeared from apparently nowhere to end the performance, in one case first filing a farcical incident report back to headquarters stating they were making art here. The experience revealed the conflict between public and privatized space in downtown Johannesburg, and the reality that the apparently free sidewalk is often invisibly regulated, while the script for tolerated behavior is circumscribed. The walk suggested different notions of public space as literally shared ground, and hence the possibility for public art also to derive less from a sanctified validation and perhaps more just out there for the seeing, the kind of art of the commons. By traversing some of the most highly densified and diverse communities in Johannesburg, they were also an effective means to transfigure perspectives and find common ground along the way. Shoe Shop, in short, suggested to me another way of conceiving of public space, as common space as it's referred to, instead, an intersection where public and private interests conflict and sometimes contest. Shoe Shop was largely concerned in various ways with absence or presence, as the curators first mentioned in an early meet. I won't go into more of the projects now, but some of them engage directly with migrancy and its more harrowing experiences, instigating in turn the stories of passers-by, many themselves migrants in inner-city Johannesburg, with their own narratives to tell. Who is present and absent in our idea of a public? It made visible through changes in tempo and emphasis those cracks in the asphalt that Dung spoke about, the pauses in the musical score of our transposition becoming a vital part of the reading. It also resisted our soundbite culture of trying to make sense in quick and easy steps amid superficial relations from the sheer volume and velocity of our communications, as articulated by Sherry Turkle in her book Alone Together. It demanded instead a long, circuitous walk, a kind of loitering in fact, to immerse in that in-between space where different sensibilities can coexist. This didn't mesh with everyone. Some found the open-ended nature of the project, which refused to be pinned down, difficult to grasp, but others understood this as poetic. I think it's about life's journey, said one. The second event, A Maze Interact, was a 5-day fusion of art, gaming, technologies, and music underscored with an idea to play the city in analog and digital ways, curated by Torsten Widemann. This indie festival included a game jam exhibition, Machinima, which are films created from computer games, a symposium, workshops, club night, and street games. It basically elasticized ideas about public space into more hybrid combinations. In this image, you see a screengram from a game jam where participants were challenged to create a video game in 48 hours based on Johannesburg. The theme was Chop Shop, so it was about reuse and recycling and resampling, and Johannesburg is very much a city that has to do with those kinds of themes. This particular one, Reconstitution Hill, inverted the idea of the inner city, which is often prejudicially feared in a way as a dystopia. The inhabitants here were the only ones that survived in a futuristic cyborg battle. The player in this game must keep their humanity index as close to 100 as possible as they go about their mission to prevent the incorporation of cybernetics into humanity. As their humanity index drops, vulnerability to the negative influences of the city increases. Reconstitution Hill provides a further definitional elasticity of what we earlier started thinking about as common space. New media art is no longer about a computer terminal and a mouse, but, to quote, entering public space, projections, and physical computing and interacting between people, according to Amaze artist Andrzej Boleslavsky. This notion is akin to what Amin has called stretched geographies of association. But in the stretch, the body is still the key interface to an immersive experience. Wits University academic Dziubak emphasized this visceral nature of digital worlds in a public lecture. An Amaze module that effectively demonstrated this corporeal element was the street game Flipside by performance artist Anthea Moyes and Sebastian Quack of Berlin's Invisible Playground, which devises games for cities and publishes their rule sets freely online. Flipside was a collaborative game of teleported reality between Johannesburg and Berlin using green screen technology. The premise was to make sense of two places at once while giving a new meaning. Each team represents a TV production crew competing against the clock to teleport themselves into different places, to capture scripted stories received by instructors called reality dealers and show them to the world. The scripts are devised from real storylines in Berlin and Johannesburg, and the green screen technology transfers the skits back between cities. Teams get extra points for things like using their props well or including members of the public in their skits to spice up reality of it. The game conjures a participatory encounter that conflates different dimensions and modes of being to facilitate a co-produced kind of third space, as articulated by Edward Dziubak following Henry Lefebvre. Neither the material space that we experience nor a representation of it, but, to quote Margaret Crawford, a space of representation bearing the possibility of new meanings, a space activated through social action and social imagination, where unexpected intersections possess liberatory potential. In the broader analysis, Amaze builds upon a developing notion of third space into hybrid fusions and conflations with the body as mediator, a cyborg city. Intangibles like imagination, effort, and deflay are key. Thus, through a gaming trope, an idea of a transparent city begins to take root, as conceived by Roland Atkinson and Paul Willis. They say this more mutable hyperrealism conflates the authentic and the game world elements in something called slipping, when we start to read the city in terms of our game, or sieging if that effect is more sustained. They further find that simulation opens up a new vantage point in which play, interactivity, experimentation, and fantasies of elective identity produce slightly different ways of engaging with and reimagining urban space, what they more broadly call an interactive turn in the urban experience. This role-playing world has its own notions of validity. The third event, Spines, comprised two parallel performance art projects held over 3 days each to explore the transport lines of Johannesburg. The first, United African Utopias, was a fantasy play that walked participants through Johannesburg inner city to reimagine it as utopia, with artists staging interventions at regular intervals, and to Alexandra Township, on foot, by elevator, bus, taxi, dancing, on a high-speed train, a bicycle, and finally a blindfolded short walk. The narrative script was broadcast in real time on pirate radio, fusing en route notions of reality and fiction, past and future, here and there. As one participant put it, the radio let you own the experience. It was curated by Zhao Rechia, Tanya Kroon, Hans Nava, and Mpumi Mtata. This utopian journey started at a rent-a-wreck car hire in Doornfontein mixed-use inner-city neighborhood, where we were greeted by our costume guides, dressed evocatively like air stewards from the future. On our city walk, in well-policed formations of two, we experienced along the way a mix of interventions that ranged in tempo and pitch. We were stalked by artists with quiet stagings, like an acupuncture of the space, and then hailed by a guide with a megaphone, commenting on passing architectural features. I won't go into the full details here, but events were precisely cued, like a bus pulling up just on time to collect us streetside, and the whole experience was shaped like an alternate reality. Our quick pace, our transience and otherworldly props and evident humor were the kind of soul that smoothed things over. This is a map of the route that we walked. In-house project, the second and final partner project in Spines, took participants inside people's private homes, where artists staged interventions that took their cue from the immediate surrounds, to experiment with the idea of private and public space and performance itself. It was curated by Selo Pesa with Brian Mtembu and Humphrey Maleka. They were interested in asking through in-house, what are the common things that we can talk about? Performance, says Selo, puts us in the same place and creates an equal platform with nobody above the other. Participants went on a 4-hour journey by hired minibus taxi between different neighborhoods, from Soweto Township to Observatory Suburb, the inner city to Alexandra, each day a different route. And artists differently activated the destination points of private or sometimes multi-use spaces in a range of registers and modes. For myself, the experience of in-house was fundamental in completing a shift of perceptions of public space already triggered by the preceding trio that you've heard about, what it is, who has access, and in particular, how it could be differently conceived as common space instead. For instance, on a Friday in November during a preparatory research trip, we made our way through a tiny passage in Alexandra. This is a picture from that trip. Selo was showing me one of the sites where a performance would later take place. The path led from a roadside site, and then we walked up through a tightly congested alley between nested homes knitted together like a Tetris puzzle and arranged with a sculptor's logic. A door literally wedged as a wall. We walked up an incline and over a puddle. 3 men played cards at a bench on our right, and we passed a necessary single file. Hanging washing was catching a breath where it could. Children mingled. Wares competed for sale with hand-lettered signage here and there. An overhead structure necessitated a duck. Greetings were shouted in return. The passage flowed, and 5 minutes later came abruptly to an end. We popped out the other side, and my perceptions had measurably shifted. Brian Mtembu, who's an Alex resident, when I asked him, said these spaces belong to nobody and to everybody. So for in-house, the choreographers knocked on every door to that alley, explained the project, and asked to effect the performance piece there. And without fail, the residents behind those doors said, yes, feel free, the space is public. Afterwards, the choreographers revisited and thanked the same. So in addition to being a kind of ethical way to work in that space, I thought the alley effectively demonstrated common space. In part, it was the conflation of the public and the private, a sort of third space mentioned previously, activated through social action and unexpected intersections, but also because it belongs to no single authority. Everyone is claimed to the same degree, and these must continually be negotiated. Most strikingly, it led me to consider how publicness wasn't an inherent or given characteristic of the space. Rather, it's one possible dimension of the spatial, a quality that's enacted, performed, and negotiated. It's not a characteristic of the space itself then, but the dynamics within it, which are latent and can be manifested on a sliding scale. The Alex passage was not only a thoroughfare, but a very unlikely space of placemaking, albeit one, importantly, where people are forced into sharing certain acts that they may very well wish to have other kinds of spaces for. It demonstrated to me a different kind of thought about public space, what architect Henning Rasmus calls leftover space between things or objects. He told the Trinity Session Public Art Conference that public space was just space where people do stuff, the glue around everything else, he says, not these small, discrete pockets of designated areas. It's no coincidence then that this alley, this resilient kind of alley, staged one of the most compelling performances from Common Sense duos Stan Wannett and Leila Anderson, a staged accident on either side of this alley. On one side on the pavement, as if Stan had tripped and spilt both his eggs that are for sale and his egghead, and at the other end of the alley, Leila lay supine on a stretcher as if a medical procedure had gone wrong, mirrors reflecting the audience. Both were events frozen in time. They kept restaging a kind of disaster scenario at intervals. Leila kept picking up the dropped eggs, nursing them, dazed and seemingly traumatized. The audience was immensely curious and speculated what they thought had happened in the storyline, how Stan lay so still for so long, and whether they used blood to get wax that shade of pink. Curiosity that was in large measure the response to these interventions on the whole, and a willingness to guess and not fully understand. Reflecting on these works, the first thing to say, it's got 2 essential things, is that New Imaginaries projects as a whole were ephemeral, transient, and nomadic. In this, they suggested to me a riposte to current creative economies discourse that validates art economically, because in their ephemerality, the interventions could not be captured, financially or otherwise. And that is the essential argument, if you like, that the book makes. It offers, through its shadowing of the trilogy, an alternative proposition for why art matters, building an accretive case towards an art of the commons. Of course, as researcher trying to write about ephemeral artworks is another challenge, but we'll put that one aside for now. Linked to this critique is the issue of uncertainty, a key thematic in that research. I devote a chapter in the book to that topic, to speak to other disciplines interested in city imaginings by showing how ambiguity, coping with paradox, and its transfiguration is often embraced as part of artistic practice and visual thinking. Just very briefly, as an elaboration on that point, a prevailing trend in current arts policy, including our own in South Africa, holds that art must contribute to the economy, its GDP, to grow jobs, to bring in foreign exchange, that it must justify itself in material and measurable terms. Our strategy is called Mzansi's Golden Economy. Mzansi means South Africa, which tells you everything you need to know. It follows a well-developed Euro-American discourse based in turn on the creative city idea, but it is an instrumentalist notion that sidelines the non-measurable effects. In the UK, it is interesting to note there's been a recent spate of long-term inquiries around cultural value. Some very interesting findings. I know of at least 4 of them in the last few years. In South Africa, there is currently a review on the white paper on arts and culture, so we await future direction on this approach. The second point to underscore from New Imaginaries is that all these projects can be said to have a performative aspect. From this I draw a key conclusion, quite obvious by now, that public space is daily performed. It's dynamic and alive, a negotiated living thing, not static and preordained entity granted by definition. It's instead contested and reconstituted by people themselves making their wills, in what the book calls common space. This belongs to everybody and nobody, and competing claims must be constantly negotiated anew. This kind of space is renegotiated from the ground up through what Paul Chatterton calls commoning. To quote, "The common is full of productive moments of resistance that create new vocabularies, solidarities, social and spatial practices and relations and repertoires of resistance," unquote. Alive and mutable, hence the title of the talk, Performing the Present. We'll move on to the rest of it in turn, building upon that basic thought and looking at urban space as performed space. Visual art practices since the 60s have opened themselves up to a theatricality that suggests processes of art production and reception as performative, with meaning enacted through interpretive engagements rather than static object, with prescribed signification according to Jones and Stevenson. Such visual art practices tap into the shifting nature of the city's multiple modalities and what academics refer to as a broader performative turn. Forms of life, we might say, are now mobilized, writes John Arry, who identifies an emergent mobility complex, from long-distance leisure to manufactured goods, foodstuffs, and friends. So, let's apply the performative turn to my home city for a brief change of scenery. We'll visit a sound art intervention called Cape Town Under, the Third Voice, that differently animates what we're talking about from a kind of undercommons. Many cities have secret underground lives, and Cape Town is no exception. Unbeknown to most of its citizens, it has a lattice of tunnels running underneath its roads. The secret network stretches from the famous Table Mountain down towards the sea. Built during the Dutch colonial era, primarily for sewerage purposes, these were later canalized and then built over by the contemporary city. These days, stormwater gushes through. I conceived Cape Town Under, the Third Voice as a performative work manifested in collaboration with Pauline Piat, who uses her voice as a key medium. The sound intervention from the underground was performed for a 2013 arts festival themed around the issue of land. That in turn was hinged to the 100-year-old Native Lands Act, cited previously, and its contemporary endurances. In our collaborative response, Pauline performed a looped lullaby for an hour from 3 different tunnel sites over one November weekend. Our key challenge was to negotiate an agreed way to interact artistically with this intriguing yet heavily burdened space that still allowed other histories to speak. The end result was to strip the proposed lullaby of its vocabulary and repeat only its musical form. This let the tunnel co-create with its own echoing character, a kind of third voice. That solution was generated in rehearsal by the site itself, when Pauline projected her voice around its chambers and found it cut it off cold in places, while in others it looped back in bold phrasings. These are just some images from a research trip into the tunnels to try and find the right kind of site and access point to make the work from. You can see the incredible spaces, and the acoustic potential was immediately apparent. So it was part of I ran this thing called Guerrilla Gallery, which tries to find alternative spaces as a platform to make art, not in the kind of white cube space, but in spaces in the city, strange spaces in the city. The 3 live performances of improvisation surprised passers-by in public space, with song emerging from street manholes as an improvised speaker system. In 2 of the 3 sites, Pauline was unseen, positioned below a secured but uncovered manhole interface. The 3rd site was a trapdoor into the military bastion of Cape Town's historic castle, a fort built in the 1600s. Here she was visible to craft viewers standing on a plank across stormwater rushing through the tunnel lattice. These images are from the military interface with the trapdoor, where you can actually see her standing on the plank. So power structures similar to the stormwater underscore our daily lives, but are often invisible. Cape Town under the Third Voice made evident hidden infrastructures dating from the colonial era through an ephemeral gesture of song. The Endurance Lullaby performance was a feminine act emerging from a militarized built environment, a fort on the one hand and a former military parade ground on the other. It conflated ideas of private and public space. It emerged from the hidden underground into congested public space above to ignite spontaneous dialogues that triggered keen curiosity in unexpected ways. The Grand Parade, today a busy public square, is best known as the staging for Nelson Mandela's first public speech from the adjacent City Hall, when he finally emerged from prison a free man. The square is adjacent to a major transport hub, and the audience for that intervention was primarily a commuting public en route to various destinations. They were generally intrigued to catch a surprising glimpse of tunnels from a temporarily open access point. Through this surprising rupture in public space and a lullaby stripped of the particularities of language, we were able to find some common ground. This is the site before we opened up for the performance. There it is, sitting in the distance, looking like nothing much. It's Pauline going down to hide away. So she's not visible, it's just there's a lullaby coming out of there and people are curious. Listening in. And there's no explanation given, so they made up their own kind of stories for what they thought was happening there. And then what happened was a kind of echo set off. There's a whole chain of closed manholes, and it became kind of ecosystem across the ground. And so people started lying down and listening to the echo across the streets. I'm just going to play a very quick 2.5 minutes, which is from the Grand Parade. So you will hear the sound of the water, the sound of the voice, and the sound of the cars and people up above. rage to wake you from your slumber. Final section, emerging from the literal underground to literal underground. We will fathom how a dead monument came back to life as tinder for a nationwide protest movement. It became a vector of resistance and radical reimagination of the public sphere, and hence a way to reconsider city futures. We view its fate and understand the wake of its disappearance through the performative turn, outlined above, ending with the latest manifestation of this afterlife, a student occupation of UCT's Fine Art and Drama campus. A very quick recap of events will bring you to this current moment. I'm going to really summarize here because it's been quite a complex set of events. I'll just give you the bones of it. So in April 2015, a student wearing a bright pink construction worker's helmet, bare-chested and blowing a whistle, threw the contents of a portable toilet canister over the University of Cape Town's statue of Cecil Don Rhodes. This artwork of a colonial-era mining magnate and statesman was created in the 1930s by Marion Woolgate. Jumani Makwele protested white arrogance written on a board around his neck by throwing human feces onto the sculpture in a performative gesture. You can see the remnants there on the plinth. The public artwork looks out over the southern suburbs from its elevated central position on the campus, the public heritage site, where students daily file past. Makwele's action set off a series of further interventions on the statue itself and daily student meetings at its feet, which in turn spurred action against other so-called dead monuments at campuses and other public sites across the country. Within this ripple effect, a Twitter hashtag became a social movement, Rhodes Must Fall, in a digital second life. This performative act erupted into a national call for structural transformation, not only regarding universities, around the tagline, fees must fall, which was obviously about financial access and other issues, but also society at large to recalibrate the public sphere 21 years into democracy. The cause of the four lists, as they've become known, has also resonated globally, it's fair to say, with struggles in other spaces and places. There have been ongoing protests, occupations, inquiries, and other activations since. Just an important interlude here to put this act into context. Makwele's act of throwing shit at a statue has a political context. According to social justice movements in the Western Cape, inadequate sanitation constitutes an example of what they call infrastructural violence. So some people, like academic Jacqueline Kopp, call this slow violence. Similar tactics with spilled sanitation canisters, they come from chemical toilets, colloquially called laptops or porta potties, have been used at the airport and provincial legislature, among other sites, to literally raise a stink in public space. This in a city where some communities are still forced to use bucket systems and informal sanitation solutions. So the underlying idea is to link slow violence and security, and in turn show up widening inequalities that, while global in reach, are acutely felt in contemporary South Africa. So in that sense, the UCT Rhodes artwork is not only historical, but for many symbolically reinscribes a contemporary reality. An artist who regularly works in public space described it to me this way: it has deep psychological impacts that last a lifetime, and the statues in this public space. It impacts on a person's quality of life, perceptions of self, how they feel, and relations to the world they live in. So this act of rage also relates to the unspeakable, as Njabule Ndebele puts it. The dual effects of poverty and inequality are deeply felt, but in ways that are often difficult to articulate. So the statue was subsequently created and temporarily banished while its fate is decided, and that's where things are right now. But its second lives have continued apace, allowing meaning to be renegotiated in the performative present. It's the spectral afterlife of the artwork that is of most interest to me, and I've been documenting its constant mutations. So its plinth basically is transformed over time. So it first got covered in garbage wrap, as you saw, and then there was this poem by David Diop got put on its base. That was when it was created, and the student meetings then moved and took over an occupation of the admin building instead. Once it was removed, this graffiti image of how the statue, the shadow of the statue got put at the base, which is still there today. That's just an after effect of the protest. It's been daubed with all sorts of patterns over time. CJ was here. A chair got put on the top, and people have been doing different reenactments on that chair. Graffiti, signage, people making their feelings known, have a seat and dream about our future. That's cross that was put up there for a while is a symbol of Marikana, which was a terrible tragedy where 44 miners were killed when they were protesting. They were shot by police. This memorial is right next to the statue, so you can see, remember Marikana, that's the same event that it's referring to. It's a war memorial. That's also graffiti on the plinth. Sit at your own risk, self-explanatory, and one of the most recent signages, the Scouts have stuck up some international Morse code, which sort of relates, I guess, to trying to find some way to communicate across different languages, I guess. So, the empty plinth poses a question: what do we do with the unfinished business of the past? It's about the politics of the void and what comes next. And of course, as you can see, the plinth is not empty at all. It's in this constant kind of performative life. It's an ongoing, it's being constantly reenacted. Malcolm Miles says that history represented by statues is a closure, inhibiting the imagining of alternative futures by denying the possibility of alternative pasts. But if it's an opening in society's received structural values, dislocating the assumptions of an official history, it's an act of resistance, he says. Seen through a more ephemeral lens, zombie monuments demonstrate a mobile dimension of spectral meaning, a mutability that supersedes their materiality. The latest reenactment took this artwork's afterlife into the heart of the art cognoscenti in the city in an intriguing intervention, which is where we end this evening's talk. So in October last year, just a few months ago, the fine art and drama students of the University of Cape Town turned their satellite campus into an art protest. The entrance to Michaelis School of Fine Art, which is sort of separate from the rest of the university, located in Cape Town CBD and where I also studied, was barricaded to create a formal shutdown as part of the broader Fees Must Fall movement. Beyond an occupation called Umhlangano, which means gathering, renamed key campus venues. Naming was a big part of the exercise. Its premise was a safe space from which to work, live and create artworks, performances and discussion on how to move things forward. A large part of the student body was comprised of an LGBTQI collective, and the intervention included a rolling series of artworks created from whatever materials were to hand or donated. The campus literally became a live art installation. It was theory and practice. Some of these makeshift artworks were including balloons, funny enough, were forcibly removed at one point by security guards who deemed them illegal structures that contravened a court interdict. The Michaelis Art Gallery became a dual protest exhibition and a sleeping area, while campus grounds were a shifting installation. The first point on the declared talk agenda for Umhlangano was the politics of space. Our space read a cardboard sign next to a series of inverted chairs. The occupation eventually came to an end in late December last year when students reached a broader agreement with UCT about a way forward in a formal reconciliation process. There was a third-party facilitator to assist with that. The art school truce seems to be holding at the moment, a few months later, while the National Convention looks into broader issues. So I'm told that the formal dialogues in the art campus between staff and students, while extremely difficult, operated according to the same sensibility as the occupation. So there were performances and interventions during the talks, so they functioned like an artwork. David Andrew, who heads up the Visual Arts Department of Wits University in Johannesburg, has written a thesis on that topic, how the classroom can function like a work of art. It thinks about the classroom as an installation, for instance, and celebrates the artist's multimodal sensibility. This kind of thinking in, through, and with art, like artistic research, perhaps offers an imaginative way forward for our challenges in South Africa as we reconsider how the curriculum works and how the university itself might function. The qualities Andrew cites includes Akadurai's capacity to aspire, which he says is a cultural capacity because it's about dissent, value, meaning, and communication. Another quality is Akadurai's observation: we live in an ethics of probability, an avalanche of numbers, and he urges rather an ethics of possibility, not probability, but possibility. This surely has to do with imagination, and so we are right back to where we started, with new imaginaries, the capacity to aspire, or what I suggested at the start as wishful thinking. It can be helpful to read the city with the configurations people make for themselves as indicators. Some wishes expressed by Umhlangano can be identified through their artworks and an anecdote. The first day I went to look for them, a body was lying on the tarmac, exhausted, next to a body-length list of 10 things I want to change, and topped with an array of colourful magic markers. The list was entirely empty. The woman was motionless, lying next to this unwritten list, just contemplating that task was too overwhelming. It was kind of emblematic for me because the students were literally putting their bodies on the line, and it was quite evident at each visit how tiring that was. And then their artworks. So here's a series of some images. The balloons got picked up by other arts campuses and replicated because that was a symbol of their protest, because they got confiscated. So they gathered. This is inside the gallery. The reference to bring back our carers is the students who were detained during the protests. This is part of the renaming, Helen Sabidi to rename the art school, Helen Sabidi, and putting gaffer tape over the old names, putting new names down. Izweletu means our land. Max Price is our Vice Chancellor, making fun of him. And maybe that's the final work, and maybe the most important. Recall Mbembe's words at the beginning about a crisis of imagination regarding the future. At a more recent talk with reference to Fanon and Biko, he said they were both preoccupied by one very important question: what time is it? And what is the nature of the time that is ours? The students leading the Roads Must Fall movement are time travelers, Leanne Naidu tells us. To quote, she says, their particular beautiful madness is to have recognized and exploited the ambivalence of our historical moment to push into the future. They've been working on the project of historical dissonance, of clarifying the untenable status quo of the present by forcing an awareness of a time when things are not this way, hallucinating a new time. The Rhodes artwork since its disappearance has ironically entered public space in a new way, and its performative wake is helping forge ideas about tomorrow. It's enacting new understandings of how things could be, just out of the bounds of rational thought. Somewhere art has the capacity to transport us to a place that has no time signature yet. To close then, we've seen in our triple move through public space, in Johannesburg and Cape Town, how public art may help surface issues of power, the hidden transcripts of James Scott's. Scott also addresses the hidden electricity when such transcripts are publicly spoken out. Artworks in public space have the capacity to be vectors of that current, sites of resistance and reimagination that can help recalibrate the public sphere. A significant genre of art in South Africa is underway on the performative edge. In its efflorescence, it cannot be captured and resists commodification. It's pertinent to consider this role of art making in why it matters, particularly in a current moment of financialization and creative economies dialogue that increasingly puts art in the academy to work. This kind of critical art practice doesn't manifest in a language that easily lends itself to collectivist ideas of representation. Rather, it experiments with a counter-public imaginary more concerned with articulating invisibilities and communicating something of the ineffable instead. It has a nomadic sensibility that responds to an underlying flux, rather than a monumental rigor or certainty. It's an imagery that aspires towards the city as a more meaningful commons, and perhaps makes of us all wishful thinkers. Thank you.